Okay, we're on.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, everyone, and welcome to the Pliant Automation webinar. We're going to give everybody about 2 more minutes to join, and then we'll get started. Good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the Pliant webinar. My name is Dave Hagenbarth. I'm the Vice President of Systems Engineering here at Pliant, and I'm joined today by Ves Bakalov, our CEO and founder.
Hello, everyone.
I'd like to, in the next 30 minutes, take you all through the value prop behind Pliant and a quick overview and a demo of the functionality of Pliant. There will be follow-on webinars that dig more deeply into different technologies that we are able to automate. But today I thought I'd keep it really high level and just give you a good overview of who Pliant is and what we do. So the agenda for today, again, quick introductions, which we've done, overview slides, which I'm going to do right now, and then a couple quick use case demos, and we'll move on from there. So the idea behind Pliant automation. So we sit in the automation space. We're making people's jobs easier by adding automation, but where are we adding that automation? Well, there are a lot of players in the automation space. A lot of them focus on business process. So I'm taking Salesforce and filling in blocks and things like that. That's not what we decided to focus on. Although it's a functionality we could certainly perform, Pliant decided to focus on the infrastructure. And the challenge we saw was that on the left here, there were a lot of folks in the world who had very great operational skills in the infrastructure space. Deploying ITSM, so the whole life cycle across infrastructure gear that ranges from stuff that was bought 20 years ago to stuff that you bought last week. A couple of evolutions we've seen is as manufacturers release new gear, they release more and more functionality via the APIs. The same thing we saw in that same left-hand circle was that the folks that run a lot of this gear their careers were spent in running the infrastructure, not in learning programming. So on the right side, we introduced a skill set that were programmers. They were developers. They were taught how to program, and they were largely came up many times in the application space, not the infrastructure space. And so in the DevOps world, we saw people who could write code, and we had APIs, and we'd show them our infrastructure APIs, and they sometimes would write what we needed. Sometimes it was not quite what we needed because they had no real insight into the world on the left, right? The infrastructure world. And so the idea behind Pliant is to use a low-code, no-code solution to sort of merge those two ideologies. So instead of sending your staff out for Python training, you give them 5 days of Python training and hope they come back as, Python programmers, we figured out a drag and drop way that interacts with all of these infrastructure APIs and allows you to do that programming without having to have that DevOps skill set. Where do we sit? Well, we sit in the middle of lots of different stuff. So if there's an API to be had, we ingest that API, we build these building blocks, which I'll show you in a second, and we allow you to interact with the infrastructure around you. It could be cloud-based, right? There's definitely an API interface for all the major cloud services like Amazon, Azure, Google Cloud, etc. But as I mentioned, the infrastructure is coming along too. So now whether it's from Juniper or F5, whether we're looking at cloud-based DNS like NS1 or on-prem info blocks as IPAM solutions, all of these come with APIs and all of them need to interact. If we think about the journey from building an application, backwards, right? We have apps that sit on top of platforms that sit in top of an infrastructure that needs IP addresses, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that probably wants to bubble up into something like ServiceNow for ITSM so we understand what it is we built. Pliant can automate all of that using drag and drop blocks. In the world of Pliant, basically this shows you what we've done. On the left, you'll see all the Node.js code to build out a virtual machine in Amazon. Now we picked Amazon because the code was easy, whatever. We've done this also for all the on-prem vendors as well, things like Cisco and F5 and others that I'll show you in a moment. But in this instance, this is the Node.js code on the left-hand side that would be required to spin up a virtual machine in Amazon. And notice two parts to this. We have the config JSON and then the create instance JSON. And in the config piece, you have access key ID and secret access key. So if you were going to write this in Node.js, could be the same in Python, Ruby on Rails, doesn't matter. This is something you would need to have, right? You'd have to have the instance and you would have to have the secret and the access key to go along with it. In Pliant, we've taken all this code and we've turned it into this block on the right called run instances. So now I can drag and drop a block that's called run instances, and it has basically all the contents you see on the left in a block. And the first thing you'll see, sort of, across from the config JSON, is this auth key. So one of the ways that Pliant has added security to the whole idea of scripting in general is that we've separated configuration from the scripting itself. So we let you build out an authentication key and store it as a tag. So on the right, you see admin/new EC2. That's an authentication key that I could use as a script builder inside of Pliant to build this VM, but I have no way to go back and then create stuff later. If I give you the access key and the secret key and ask you to write a Python script, you can go home and write 10 more Python scripts, spin up a bunch of machines in AWS, and I have no way to stop you from doing that because you had to have that information to do your job. On the Pliant side, on the right side, I've simply given you a tag. Another thing we do in Pliant is we actually take role-based access down to an individual API call. So I could give you run instances, maybe create VPCs. There's obviously infrastructure stuff you would do in AWS before this, but I could give you the ability to build create blocks, and you'll watch me do this, and not the ability to do delete blocks. So we do all the way down to a single API function. We control the access. And again, you're given a tag so you don't have those credentials. The other thing that regularly happens is I'm going to change my passwords. And so how do I do that? Well, in Pliant, I can simply update that password in one place, and all of the scripts that have been built have their password updated too. So I'm not going back through and opening my individual, if you're using Ansible workbooks, inventories, whatever, or your Python scripts for this. So you can update it all in one place. The other thing we've done is in the body of this, on the left-hand side, hopefully you can see some of the code here. This code is not only to spin up the virtual machine, but it's also to take care of logging functions. We find a lot of times that folks, especially on the infrastructure side, who do development as well, tend to write scripts that do the function that needs to be done, whatever that is, and they don't bother to write logging code. And they'll only write logging code later. If something doesn't work and they can't figure it out, they'll put the debug statements in. We've baked in all the logging into this block as well. So we give you this single block that does the function. It hides the authentication, but gives you the same results. And we have all this additional logging that you didn't have to write. So you don't have to worry about syntax. You don't have to worry about security. And you get the verbose logging that operations might need, especially if you hand this off. So people write scripts, they hand it off to operations. It doesn't work right the next day. There's no way to debug that. So we've taken all the power of the APIs that AWS has provided us, and we've packed that into a single block with authentication. So what are we out doing? We're basically out doing low code or no code integration. I'm going to show you this in a demo. The idea is to simplify automation so that ops people, even regular business people, can create workflows that do automated tasks that really reduce the stuff in your day you didn't want to do to begin with. Some other benefits that come along with this are our ability to go cross-platform. So you can almost do what people have talked about for a while in intent-based networking. Maybe the ideology being, I want to instantiate an access list in my edge router from Cisco, my firewall from Palo Alto, and my F5 firewall on the other side, or a different internet connection. The ops person that does that, or the person in security that does that, would need to swivel chair, right? They're bringing up 3 different browsers to interact with those interfaces, or a command line to 2 browsers. With Pliant, we take that away with the integrations that we have, and I'll show you those in the demo as well. But we give you the ability to say, hey, I want to deploy this particular access list across my infrastructure. I don't care about the syntax so much. I just want to push this out. Another place that we've been very integral for customers is our ability to go and take data from one place and put it in another. So we had a customer that was taking about 30 hours a month to develop a report, which was really data in a spreadsheet. But the data for that spreadsheet came from a number of different systems, and it took them a long time to go to the system, fetch the data, format the data, put it in a way that the spreadsheet could be useful. So they spent about 30 hours a month doing that. In about 4 hours, we had written an automated workflow that collected the data from all those different data locations, applied the structure, if you will, and pushed it back out in an Excel sheet that they could use. And that whole process ran in like 2.5 minutes. So we saved 30 hours down to 2.5 minutes. That was one benefit. But the other benefit to the business was they were now able to actually run that report hourly or daily or weekly. Whereas before, when it took a person 30 hours to assemble and format it, they could only offer that once a month. There was no way they were going to spend like some full-time person all day long every week building a report. So not only was the power of just not having to spend 30 hours doing something, it was that we could turn around back to the business a report and they could have it as frequently as they wanted it. So I hope all that makes sense. I'm going to actually flip over to my demo box now and just show you a bit of what that looks like. In the meantime, there should be a chat option in your browser as well, or however you attach to Zoom today. If there are any questions, feel free to drop them in there, and Vess will reply, or I'll reply when we get done here. So this is the interface to Pliant. We've made a very elegant but simple interface. The value in Pliant is really the work we do and not the graphical output, but you want to know that things are running. So if you look at the screen here, you can see some very simple things. One, we have the flows in the last 24 hours. And when we talk about flows, we mean workflows, or some series of API actions to create an outcome. And so we have the workflows that have run in the last 24 hours. We have the workflows that have run in the last 5 minutes. And then we have the last 5 successful and the last 5 failed. And these are the logging statements that happen. So for every workflow we execute, we generate a log for it. And that will show you who ran it, the time it started, the time it ended, and then we give you a UUID that you can index on in case you want to go back and find these later. Pliant ships with about enough disk space for 3 to 5 days of logging. We fully expect the customers will take this output and send it to whatever they use for governance and security, most likely. It could be Splunk, could be LogLogic, could be Elasticsearch, whatever the logging solution you might have. We're going to send this and we're going to provide the output. So we can see here that the flow was a list of community string out of an F5 box, which I'm going to show you in a minute how we did. We can see the object identifier, the community string, and the access string. So these were the things that were listed in this particular workflow, and that'll be sent to the logging solution. A lot of times we get used for audit. So show me the settings for all these things across all of my servers. You want that to come back in a log that you can access later to prove to whomever in governance and security that the servers are in compliance. We also have the ability to evaluate those results, right, and mediate or remediate different things in the environment as well. We have a log screen, simply shows you the runs that I showed you before with a bit of filtering. Job screen, this is where we would do automatic jobs. You saw the list community strings before. We wouldn't be much of a automation solution if you couldn't run things automatically. And then in administration, we have the typical things you would expect. We have user management, we have role management. And so user management is just that, add and delete users. A user may have a role, and roles are what I talked about a little earlier, where we can limit your access to any given API or set of APIs. So I can create a role, my demo user's role, and inside of this, it brings up a screen. I know this is a little complex to look at right off the bat, but down the left-hand column are all the different manufacturers that we've integrated with to date. These integrations, these are actually folders, and inside a folder, a lot of times we have more folders. So we've imported about 1,800 different API calls from AWS. If I go down to EC2, which people know is pretty much the compute, this is a folder, and I could give you view and execute rights at the folder level, and you can do anything with EC2. Or I can literally come in to all the different individual actions that you would probably want to use in EC2, things like allocate address and allocate host, and I could tie you all the way down to a role around just those particular functions. So again, going back to that slide I had where you saw a tag, right? So I don't know the AWS instance. Somebody's told me this is where you're going to work, and using that tag and my role as demo, I would only be able to do things like allocate addresses, allocate hosts, but I wouldn't be able to do IPv6 addresses because I have no permissions. I'm hoping that makes sense to everyone as we go along. You'll see it in the demo a little bit more as well. As I mentioned, these are the vendors that have been imported to date, and we've gotten calls Azure, Cisco, and I can go into a little more about those, F5, Google Cloud, etc. The way we get here is really, or the way we get a new integration is really twofold. One, customer requests, or two, we're out looking at the industry and we're integrating with things we think make sense. Part of the amazing intellectual property of Pliant is our ability to take an API and ingest it and make these action blocks that go into these folders that you saw. We spent a lot of time working that through, and that gives us really two benefits. One, we can suck in and build blocks for almost any API, and we can do it really, really quickly. We're out giving our customers a 15 business day SLA around bringing those in at no charge. The other is APIs change over time, just as the code changes. This allows us to iterate on those APIs and build versioning out very, very quickly. So we've taken a lot of the what would have been manual labor to get calls into action blocks for you to use. A lot of the backend IP in this product is just magically sucking in APIs, making the blocks that you need very, very quickly. So as requests come along, we can do just that. I'm going to jump over to the workflows. This is where the interesting stuff typically happens. And I'm actually going to create a very simple workflow for you. In the use case that we had, one of the first use cases we stumbled on was someone wanted to change the S&P strings on their F5 load balancer. Not a load balancer, about 100 of them, but they needed a way to automate that so that they could do it anytime they wanted to, as often as they wanted to. So we had something like change S&P. It doesn't really matter what I call it. The idea was that they wanted to do this. They could have come, and I have my big IP interface up here. I could have done this, right? I could have come into the interface. I can find the S&P tab. I could come in and say V2, V1, V2, and I want to add an IP address. So we see we have a bunch here. And I could have said create and then created one. But in the world of Pliant, what we're going to do in this low code, no code world is we're going to do this without doing any programming at all. When I say low code, sometimes it is low code because you have to understand a bit about things. I need an output variable if I want to actually see my work. I want to output what I'm doing here so you guys can see it. A lot of times the output may be just the input of another workflow. You never even need to see it. We have a number of blocks that sort of mimic the programming world, right? Things you can do with strings and arrays, in cleaning up JSON strings and things like that. We've made all of those as blocks as well. I'm going to drag over an assign block because this is how I get my output to the screen. Now I need to do some work. I want to go set an S&P string on my F5 box. I'm going to find the F5 container. And I happen to know that the S&P stuff is inside sys, system commands. Even in system commands, there are tons of things we can do. So I can filter on just the S&P. And I'm just going to do a post S&P communities. So I bring the block over. Now we go back to the auth piece, right? So did somebody give me an auth that I can use? I have a demo F5 auth that I can use. Another thing we can do is we can actually name the blocks. So I can put some string in here. It doesn't really matter what I type. My flows then become a little more self-documenting. Also, many times when you have API commands, if they're not just list a piece of information, they typically come with parameters. When we import those APIs and build blocks like this, we change the parameters into a form. So now I can type in English the things that I want this to do. So I want my community access or my community string access to be, let's say, read only. I can make this webinar. A description, done live, whatever it might be, right? IPv6 disabled, like I don't use IPv6, I don't want that. Whatever it is, these are the parameters that come along with that block or that API that we turned into a block, and it allows me to just create those in a form. And then my object ID is simply a placeholder. I can put whatever I want in there. And then variables. So up here at the top, I had output as my variable. So I'm going to list that here. I instantiated it at the top. What value would I like output to have? Well, I'd really like it to have the output of this change string block. And so I select the change string block and result. And if I save and run this, I think we're going to see that both in this UI and in the F5 UI that we have a new community string. So at the bottom, I get a little JSON output. We can see that I've added a string called webinar. It was done live in the demo. IPv6 is disabled. They did all that without doing any sort of development or coding. And if I come in here and I refresh my screen, we'll see that indeed I have now 5 different S&P strings. So there's my webinar at the bottom. So that's a low code, no code way to sort of add a string to our block. Now, obviously, I'd made this very simple. It's a single block. It does a single box. I would then add loops and things like that to make I would run through all of my F5 boxes, and I could get that inventory from something like ServiceNow, et cetera. And I'm going to show you a little more complex workflow now. And this workflow is actually going to sort of follow the slides in that it's going to create a virtual machine in AWS. And I'll come over here. The idea is to create the virtual machine in AWS. Once AWS has created the virtual machine, I'm gonna instantiate or load Docker on it. And then on top of Docker, I'm gonna load a small web server. And then I'm gonna have this web page, but I don't wanna call the web page by IP. I really wanna call it by its name. So I'm gonna take the IP address that Amazon assigns us when we built the virtual machine. I'm going to take that to our cloud DNS provider, NS1. I'm going to register that with NS1. It's going to give me a DNS name that I can go back and actually hit the web page that I instantiated. So I'm going to click run on the workflow. And I'll just walk you through this a little bit. So there are lots of different programming things you can do inside of Pliant. Here is one giant if loop. We're just going to begin by saying if I have the secret key, which I've instantiated up above, let's do this whole workflow. We have function boxes, so you could put in code you've already written. We have a lot of different places where that's the case. We have an Ansible plugin. If you've written a ton of Ansible scripts, you can drop your Ansible scripts in. We don't want people to have to recode. We just want people to be able to code and then use the output of that code in the next block to do whatever they're doing. So we go down and we create key pair, because this is how we'll get our PEM key to SSH back to the instance that we create. And here's that run instances block that you saw on the slides. I have a body. So in the body, like we said before, there's lots of things that I'm going to need really to understand how to build this virtual machine. And we've taken all those parameters and put them in a nice form. I have a drop down on what size I would like it to be. I'm going to be able to tell it what zone I want it in, if there's more than one zone, et cetera. All the different things that you would fill in for Amazon, you would have done here. And you can see at the very bottom of my screen, this flow is already finished. So I've already created a instance. I do a loop here to describe that instance. And once it's up, I actually take what we call as an SSH block, and I just echo an empty string. So I want to understand when my box is actually accessible. So once it is, I'll break out of that loop. I'll do an apt-get update, so I'm updating my box. I'll do an install Docker IO, which we did while I've been talking. That's all been running in the background. I then pull a small container, which has a web server on it. I then open port 80. And once all that work's done, I went over to NS1. I said, give me all the records. I'm going to loop through the records to make sure that I have a zone for this. Once I determine I have a zone for it, I'm going to come down and say, hey, I have this IP address. I've evaluated in the zone whether there was an existing IP already. If there is, I do an update record. So maybe I'm load balancing and this is the second server I've added. Or if there's not in NS1, I create the DNS record. So we can see over in my AWS, I've created this new box. It was just up a couple minutes ago, 10:28. I can come over to my NS1 portal, and if I refresh this, we'll see that I have an IP address, 18.25, that I've registered, and the bottom of my workflow contains that as well, right? So this is my box I've created here at 18.225, 8.180. And lastly, if I go to ns1.demo.pliant.xyz, which was the record we created, we see this little web page that we put up. So what we've done is we've taken a series of steps and executed them. You can specify blocks to execute either serially or in parallel. So given the scenario where I might want to do 100 F5 boxes, I might want to do them quickly. And I can actually execute those either serially, one at a time, or again, as a whole, I can just say, boom, make an API call to all of them, update them immediately. That's great for things like blacklisting IPs and other things. So that's pretty much the demo I had for you today. I do want to call to your attention down the right-hand side of the box here, all of the different integrations we have. It talked a little bit about Ansible, Appneta is in here, Arista. We've tried to cover off the manufacturers that make the most sense. We are adding a couple manufacturers, if not more, every 2 weeks, and we're also addressing the needs of our customers in a very similar manner. So I hope you found this interesting. Our intention here at Pliant is to begin a series of webinars where we dig into a particular technology. So how do we integrate ServiceNow and the updating of multiple different platforms? How do we do a server, how do we evaluate servers for potential security risks and remediate those in real time? So those are some of the webinars that you're going to see coming up very shortly. I don't see any questions in the chat box, but I will give Vasa a chance here to add any last minute comments or answer any questions that he may have saw in the chat box.
Well, no questions yet, but again, I want to thank everyone for their time. I think Dave did a good job giving us an overview of the platform, showing us the capabilities it has. Again, at a very high level, we are going to be doing the series, as he said, so stay tuned for more and definitely stay engaged. If there's particular technologies you guys want to see, I would be very happy to make sure those get included inside the next set of webinars. And as Dave said, if there are technologies you didn't see today, that's no problem. We do certify new systems all the time, and we do offer our customers a 3-week turnaround on new certifications. If you come to us and you're like, hey, let's say I really want to have I don't know, for example, their integration built into the system, we will take care of that quite quickly.
And we did have one question Nicole brought up, deployment models, which I really should have addressed. Pliant is designed to deploy from the cloud. It's a microservices architecture based on top of Docker and Kubernetes. But we realize that there are certain situations and customers where on-premise might be a more preferable way to handle the deployment. So we do have an on-prem model as well. The fact that it's microservices and containers allows us to place it anywhere. There's no penalty in terms of the version you're running, cloud versus on-prem deployment, nor do we license the model any differently, cloud versus on-prem. So it really comes down to whether you want to host the infrastructure that allows this automation to function in your environment, or if you want to run it from the cloud and put the burden on Pliant to do that for you. So it definitely is a customer choice when we come to the model of deployment.
And it's still more or less a Pliant managed service, even if it is built inside your cloud. We'll take care of the upgrades and making sure things are running smoothly. Everybody basically runs the same version, an evergreen kind of situation. So it's very much down to your security preference. All right, we have another question. Can workflows be called from workflows for code reuse? And absolutely. And that's a very key thing. Once you start building a lot of these, you end up building sort of, I guess, little blocks that you may want to reuse over and over again. For example, application provisioning, which in your environment may involve pulling certain things from repositories, or you want to do certain checks, make sure it's always registered with ServiceNow. You don't want to be going through and doing that every single time. Dave showed you the output at the end. That output actually would get passed to the next block upstream, so that JSON will become essentially the output of your workflow. In this case, upstream, if you were to call the NS1 workflow from upstream, you would get to have the keys right there, the IP address, and you can store that, for example, inside Jira to have that for later use if necessary. So calling flows is certainly something that is not only a feature, but encouraged in proper design.
Awesome.
All right. Folks are asking if there will be a copy for the recording. Yes, absolutely. We will publish that in a couple of days on our website, and you will be able to pull it up. Generally speaking, another question is, do people have to specify individual API calls, or do we do everything? In general, we do everything. Like if we're going to cover a system, we are going to cover that system in its entirety. On a certain occasion, if it's something like super complicated and we want to work with the customer to make sure it's happening correctly, quote unquote, we may do a couple at first, have them tested, and keep going. But in general, if it's a modern, RESTful or self-based API system, we'll just do the whole thing at once.
I will answer the other question that will probably come to somebody's mind, which is, can I do my own? About the turn of the year here, we'll have an SDK that comes along, so you could build your own blocks. But our intent was that you could use the platform, request them from us, and within, as Ves said, 3 weeks or 15 business days, if you will, we'll do them for you. So it will be your choice at that point. Well, I hope everybody saw the value in this. I can be reached. I'm Dave at Pliant.io, which should have probably gone on this slide. Ves can be reached at ves@Pliant.io. So if you have other questions after this is done, feel free to email us. The recording of this will be available. So if you return, I believe, to the link that you had for the live presentation today, the recording will be there. If you would like a copy of this recording, shoot me an email, again, dave@Pliant.io, and I would be glad to send it out to you. Thank you everyone for your time.
All right. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.